Hey, it's good to see you. In previous weeks we talked about the strongest characters, villains, heroes and many other interesting topics. Let's keep it up and see the most underrated bosses today. Well, obviously these are not going to be super secret hidden bosses that I snatched from Area 51. You most likely know the existence of every single one, but I will talk about the bosses that, in my opinion, deserve much more attention than they get. For each boss, I will mention their background and lore for a little bit, and then I will talk about why I think they deserve a spot on this list. Grab a snack and get ready, and as always, if you enjoy this type of content, give a like or don't. Who knows what I will do. Just take the risk if you want, but I would like if I were you. Now, I will talk about a Sekiro boss, and if you're about to say that Sekiro is not a Souls game, I am this close to adding Armored Core 6 to the list. I mean, I even picked the boss. It is Cataphract, so don't tempt me. From start to finish, Sekiro has one amazing boss after another. Naturally, there aren't many underrated bosses, but there are some bosses who simply don't get enough credit. Corrupted Monk is one of my favorite bosses in Sekiro, and there's also something quite unique about her. Corrupted Monk, who is also known as Priestess Yao, is a direct reference to a Japanese folk legend. The story is about a poor fisherman's daughter in around 7th century Japan, though some sources also say that she was the daughter of a noble. So story goes like this: one day she ate the flesh of a rather mysterious sea creature. Some say it was a magical fish, some say that she ate the flesh of a mermaid. After consuming this mystery meat, she was cursed. Without knowing her fate though, she married, and then years passed, she lost her father, and later her husband also passed away, but she hasn't aged a day since she was married. She still looked as she did in her teens. Over time, everyone she cared for and loved died one by one. So she had no one, she had nowhere to go, so she eventually moved to a temple and became a nun. After some time though, she left the temple to travel across the country. In Japan there are many towns with stories about trees that were planted by an immortal monk, who happens to be her. Yao visits Kyoto in 1449. After 8 long centuries of traveling the country and helping people in need, she ends up in Wakasa province. There, she moves to a cave and prays to be freed from her curse. She stays there motionless for so long that she eventually turns into stone. Well, this is her story. In-game, Yao is an immortal monk who protects Fountainhead Palace. When it comes to her boss fight, you will encounter the Corrupted Monk in one of the most beautiful areas in the game. Her fighting style is a bit different than most other bosses. She is much slower, but to compensate for this downside, she hits much harder than many enemies. Her combos can get quite overwhelming if given the opportunity, but her satisfying moveset always makes her a fun boss to fight against. Boss fight itself comes with its own difficulty settings. Game allows you to completely ignore her toughest phase. You can avoid the shadows by simply waiting on the tree branch. On top of that, you are allowed to instantly end the second phase. In the third phase, Centipede reveals itself and her moveset changes for one last time. Once again, game allows you to chase the boss fight by using firecrackers to blast through the last phase. Corrupted Monk is an amazing boss due to her satisfying combos, amazing boss area, and freedom given to the players throughout the boss fight. She can be quite difficult for inexperienced players, but as a minor boss she is designed in a way so that she doesn't kill the flow of the gameplay with her difficulty. She can be tough, but there are also so many ways to cheese her boss fight. Just an amazing boss throughout the fight, definitely underrated. Dark Souls 2 has many great features and moments, but sadly, when it comes to bosses, this game falls a bit short. There are so many bosses with amazing design and lore, but the gameplay itself and some frustrating design choices have always held Dark Souls 2 back. In the base game, there are many bosses, but hardly any of them have an impact on the Souls trilogy. Well, let's talk about Dark Lurker. She's a boss that gets the credit it deserves from people who encountered her, but finding Dark Lurker is so annoying that most people either don't know Dark Lurker exists or they straight up don't care about her. So, who's Dark Lurker? Well, she's a monster lurking in the dark. Simple, right? Alright, Dark Lurker is an angelic creature who lives in the depths of the dark chasm of old. It appears to have a direct relationship with the Abyss, however there's little to no lore about her existence. To access the boss fight, you must complete the Pilgrims of the Dark Covenant questline. It is an edgy cult that wishes to spread darkness across the world. So, despite Dark Lurker living in the depths of the dark, she seems to be a big problem for the Pilgrims of the Dark. As a member of the Covenant, you will be rewarded upon killing Dark Lurker, meaning this angelic being lives in the dark to prevent and stop darkness from spreading. Upon defeat, Dark Lurker drops a light soul despite living in the dark, so it is just more evidence that she is fighting the darkness rather than being part of darkness. When it comes to the boss fight itself, Dark Lurker suffers from the same issue every other Dark Souls 2 boss suffers. She is slow, she waits too much between attacks, and she has one of the most annoying runbacks. You have to go through the dungeon and you have to kill some enemies before you can even access the boss gate. It is really annoying. Compared to the newer bosses, Dark Lurker may seem simple, but when Dark Souls 2 first came out, she was a big deal. Well, she's a caster, she can switch between melee and ranged attacks, and while she has a decent number of different attacks, due to the slow nature of the boss fight, she may seem a bit repetitive. After a certain threshold, Dark Lurker splits into 2 copies and turns into a duo boss fight. Now in her second phase, she doesn't have new moves, but she is actually one of the best duo fights in Dark Souls. Her moves are easy to avoid, and both of the bosses often give you decent opening for punishing, so it is really satisfying to fight 2 Dark Lurkers at the same time. With its encounter, design and questline, it feels fresh and outside of Dark Souls 2. As an optional boss that is painful to reach, Dark Lurker doesn't get enough credits, but it is one of the best bosses in Dark Souls 2. Also a little fun fact, if you kill the copy first, Dark Lurker's AI doesn't really stop, so it continues attacking until it despawns. If you don't pay attention, she can just kill you right before she despawns, which is a fun little thing, but if it happens to you, it can be quite annoying. Let's talk about the Dragonkin soldier. One of my favorite moments during my first ever Elden Ring playthrough was discovering an entire new area underground. Encountering a Dragonkin soldier in a massive room with giant skeletons sitting on a throne was an amazing experience. This massive monster caught my interest right away because recent Souls games have mostly focused on humanoid bosses rather than monsters. In lore, these monsters are descendants of a race who were banished underground after committing treason against the Greater Will. The Dragonkin soldiers were a race that grew under the false night sky without ever seeing the real stars. Even though they never truly achieved immortality, they imitated the ancient dragons of the lands between. Now I can see why Dragonkin soldier is not a memorable boss. It has a rather weak health bar, and by the time his second phase starts, he is already moments away from dying. It suffers from a low health pool and also an underwhelming moveset, but its lightning attacks hold a special place for me. I don't enjoy caster builds, however I always enjoyed lightning oriented melee builds. When it comes to Elden Ring, there is Red Lightning, the mightiest version of all, wielded by ancient dragons, and then there's Golden Lightning, wielded by Godwin and his order. It is an imitation stated to be inferior to the Red Lightning, and then lastly there's Blue Lightning, wielded by the Dragonkin soldiers. Visually, it is the most pleasing lightning for me. However, there's only a single frozen lightning spell in the entire game. It looks good and it comes out quite fast, but since the launch of the game, it has never worked as intended. It is supposed to hit enemies multiple times, but even against massive enemies such as Placidus X, it misses half the time for no reason. Well, anyway, enough with me ranting about Blue Lightning having almost no items in the entire game. Let's go back to the boss. From its phase transition to the boss area, it never feels like a pushover. Well, until you start fighting more Dragonkin soldiers in random places at least. Dragonkin soldier is definitely one of the best monster bosses among all Souls games, and it definitely deserves more love. However, it is totally understandable that a lackluster moveset and squishy boss fight don't really offer a challenge to many players. Still, give it a chance, fight him with a weaker weapon, you won't be disappointed, it is a fun fight. To me, there's one thing Elden Ring failed to get right. It is the duo and gank bosses. From Valiant Gargoyles to Godskin duo, there are so many duo fights in Elden Ring, but none of them feels good. On release, duo bosses were way too aggressive, they would constantly attack at the same time, and now they are nerfed so hard that one of them will always stay back and watch as you fight his company. However, Dark Souls has some remarkable duo and gank fights. It is accepted by the entire community that Ornstein and Smaug and Demon Prince are amazing duo fights, and I believe they always get the praise they deserve. However, there is one gank fight I quite enjoy but I don't see people talk about. Ruin Sentinels are an early game boss in Dark Souls 2. They are not as complex or as fancy as the major gank fights, but they are quite fair and fun to fight against. Now, in lore, Ruin Sentinels are quite simple. They are loyal souls possessing armors that were made by the jailer of the Lost Bastille. Unlike other armors, they each have their own name and personality. While their primary duty is guarding the prison, they also attempted to steal Dark Soul from Ringed City at one point, but they failed and they were enslaved by the Judicators. So pretty much this is their lore, not a lot of details. What I like about Ruin Sentinels is that the fight is balanced rather well, so it doesn't punish low-level players as hard as some other gank bosses do. Within the boss area, players are given the option to pick their own difficulty. You can stay on the first platform and kill the first Ruin Sentinel alone, reduce the health bar of the second one, and then fight the last two Ruin Sentinels after weakening them. Or if you want a challenge, you can drop down right away and fight all three at the same time. When it comes to their moveset, just like many other mini-bosses, they also suffer from a limited attack pool, but their behavior works in a way to benefit the player. They have two different gap-closing lunge attacks, they can also throw their shields, and while you're fighting with one, other one usually stays passive. Also, they have slower and easy to read attacks. If Ruin Sentinels were an endgame boss, I would easily consider them to be one of the worst bosses in the game, but from their difficulty to their moveset, everything they do fits perfectly to a low-level gank fight. So, we don't get a lot of low-level gankers, but this is easily one of the best early game bosses in Dark Souls 2. Elden Ring has many side bosses. Naturally, not all of them offer a good quality. Some bosses are glorified regular enemies with boss health bars, and some are just too weak to even call a boss. But there's one optional side boss that offers an amazing fight. Even though Elemer of the Briar comes with his own issues, he's one of the best optional bosses in Elden Ring. He comes from a land where the warriors are able to move their sword in the air with their willpower. Elemer is a bell-bearing hunter who travels across the lands between to hunt nomad merchants. Well, there isn't a lot of information about Elemer's motivation, but there's a theory that Elemer worked for the Golden Order and helped them find and kill merchants who escaped from shunning grounds. But sadly, it is just a theory. We don't really know why he hunts merchants. Maybe he just likes it, maybe he's just doing it as a sport, so his motivation can be anything. After his crimes, Elemer was finally captured and he was sentenced to death. To handle his execution, House Marias moved Elemer to the Shaded Castle, where he was going to be imprisoned and executed. Right before his execution, Elemer used the technique of his homeland and snatched the executioner's sword right from his hands. Then Elemer proceeded to kill every single knight and the executioner of the House Marias. Despite sharp thorns piercing his body, he took over the Shaded Castle all by himself on his execution day. Lore-wise, he's an interesting character, but he doesn't have a deep background to praise his lore. However, boss fight is where Elemer shines. You will encounter him in a narrow room where he will perfectly utilize his fighting style. Throughout the fight, Elemer will constantly swap between range and melee combos. His dynamic fight makes him a boss worth remembering. On top of constantly changing range, he adds delayed and quick attacks within his combos to keep it fresh. Also, to catch players off guard, he occasionally slams his great shield to damage enemies around him, but this also comes with an issue. If you stay right behind him, you will always trigger his shield attack, and you can just cheese him by positioning yourself behind him and then cheesing his shield attacks. Overall, Elemer feels like a full boss rather than a side character. Where he lacks is the fact that he is reused all across the game. When it comes to lore, encountering him multiple times makes perfect sense, but it also takes away the uniqueness of the character. Another issue that arises with Elima is the low health pool. Being a glass cannon, Elima usually goes down quite fast against proper builds, which takes away the difficulty, but it is only natural for a human boss to be weaker compared to all the demigods that can be encountered throughout the game. Before we talk about the last boss on the list, let's talk about some honorable mentions. These are the characters that are not essentially underrated, but in my opinion they need a bit more attention. When we talk about the humanoid bosses, we usually think of Gale, Nameless King, Artorias, Fume Knight and some others, but I believe Gundyr deserves just as much attention as any of them. Gundyr is easily the greatest tutorial boss FromSoftware has ever made. Intimidating, yet easy to read attacks, great pacing, a fun moveset and a really interesting but also mysterious lore. Gundyr ticks all the right boxes as a boss, and in his endgame encounter his second phase is masterfully crafted. No flashy transformation, no cheesy mechanics, he just becomes angrier, he is faster, stronger and he is more skilled once his second phase starts. Truly one of the best bosses in all FromSoftware games. In my opinion, Gundyr is what they had in mind when they were designing Margit and Morgoth. Unending combos, delayed attacks mixed with quick attacks, serves as both tutorial and an endgame boss. They are similar in many ways, but I think Gundyr is just superior in every category except maybe lore. Dancer of the Boreal Valley is another boss that usually doesn't get a lot of attention. Being descendant of the gods, she has one of the most tragic stories in Dark Souls, and as a boss she offers one of the most enchanting fights in the entire franchise. From her soundtrack to her design, everything is so magical yet also dark. Where Dancer shines is her flexibility though. She is balanced so well that you can choose to fight her as your first boss right after the tutorial, or you can delay her all the way to the endgame. And in both encounters, she will offer you a fun and engaging boss fight. Her attacks are usually easy to read, however once you try to sneak in one more attack, you will be heavily punished. She is not the hardest or the easiest boss, but she is perfectly balanced and incredibly satisfying to fight. Regardless of your level, you will always have a fair fight against her. Also, I would like to add, her soundtrack is amazing, but try her boss fight without soundtrack at least once. Put on headphones and just listen the sound design, it is perfection. Souls games have so many legendary knights, such as Gale, Artorias and Ornstein, characters who not only have amazing boss fights but also come with a great and detailed lore. There's one knight who I think never gets the recognition he deserves. Looking Glass Knight is one of the most loyal servants of King Wendrick. All the way back in the golden age of Drangleic, after King Wendrick defeated the giants, Glass Knight served a crucial purpose in Wendrick's army. His duty was to protect and watch over the King's Passage. So he stayed there and he served as a brutal test against warriors who wanted to prove themselves to King Wendrick. His special shield would serve as a gate between worlds, and there he would trap challengers who dared to stand against him. After darkness covered the Drangleic castle, Wendrick escaped in order to save his soul. After his departure though, Glass Knight was positioned in King's Passage to never leave again. He would stay there and stop anyone who was sent by Nashandra in hopes of reaching King Wendrick. So this is briefly Glass Knight's lore. He is a loyal watcher who defends his king with his life. His background isn't anything particularly amazing, but the boss fight itself is where he shines. Glass Knight can be encountered at the top of the Drangleic castle. To me, Glass Knight easily has one of the greatest boss rooms in Dark Souls 2. You will meet him in the ruined tower of King's Passage, where he stands guard during a heavy rainstorm. It is easy to figure out that his tower is one of the only places in Drangleic castle where it is heavily damaged and turned into ruins. It is easy to assume Glass Knight fought countless battles in this arena before Bearer of the Curse arrived. His armor and equipment are decorated with thorns, and his helmet depicts an innocent crying face. When it comes to the boss fight itself, Glass Knight is easily the best invasion type boss among all FromSoftware games. Similar to Old Monk from Demon's Souls and Spear of the Church from Dark Souls 3, players can invade others who are fighting Glass Knight. Knowing that his mirror shield is a portal between worlds, his setting fits perfectly with his fight mechanics. mechanics. His moveset might be the biggest reason why he is underrated. Dark Souls 2 bosses are slow and straightforward, it is no surprise, but when it comes to Glass Knight, you can feel that he's especially slow in his encounter. In the newer FromSoftware games, gank bosses usually slow down when a second enemy appears, but it is not the case with Glass Knight. Due to his summon mechanic, he is designed to be a slower boss throughout the fight. He has a shield bash, 3 lightning attacks, and he occasionally does a jump attack, so there's not a lot of variety to his moveset, but also he is so slow. So I can understand that why not a lot of people like Glass Knight, but at the end of the day, he's still one of the best in his own category. Like when you think of the invasion type bosses, Glass Knight has no match. To summarize Glass Knight, I can say that he has an amazing arena and amazing armor design. His art design is easily one of the best in the entire franchise, but he falls short due to his moveset. Well, these are the bosses that I believe need a bit more love, but comment below what would be your picks for this list. Also, if you enjoy this type of content, consider giving a like and subscribe. It helps so much, but this is all for today. I will see you on the next one. Bye.